In spring 2019, four experienced divers set out to explore Florida's Peacock Springs cave system, aiming to document its unexplored chambers for a documentary. The team consisted of Michael Harrington, a 42-year-old veteran, Sarah Chen, a 38-year-old marine biologist, and the husband-wife team of Jason and Rebecca Torres. Jason brought military precision from his Navy diving days, while Rebecca, though less experienced, compensated with careful preparation. Despite thorough planning, they ignored crucial warnings about recent heavy rainfall affecting water conditions. When informed that other divers had recently aborted expeditions due to strong currents, Michael dismissed these concerns. "We're properly equipped and trained for variable conditions." This confidence would soon be tested as their ambitious expedition transformed into a desperate struggle for survival. The morning of the dive brought clear skies and calm waters, nature's deception. The team arrived at the spring basin early, methodically assembling their equipment in the golden morning light. Double tanks were strapped to backs, regulators were tested, and dive computers were synchronized. "Remember," Michael said as they stood at the water's edge, "we stay together, we follow the line, and we communicate constantly. Any problem, no matter how small, we signal immediately." They entered the water one by one, the cool 72-degree spring enveloping them as they descended toward the dark mouth of the cave. The transition from open water to the confined space was gradual but profound. Sunlight filtered through the crystal-clear water, creating dancing patterns on the limestone walls before fading entirely as they ventured deeper. The first 400 feet of the dive were uneventful. They followed the permanent guideline, their powerful lights illuminating a world few humans ever witness. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like stone daggers, while delicate formations rose from the floor in frozen testimony to millennia of geological processes. Rebecca's camera captured it all, the otherworldly beauty of this subterranean realm. Schools of blind cavefish darted away from their lights, and the occasional freshwater crayfish scuttled across the silt-covered floor. "This is why we dive," Sarah would later recall thinking. This feeling of being visitors in another world. But that world was about to turn hostile. As they approached the pothole room, approximately 600 feet from the entrance, Jason noticed the first sign that something wasn't right. The current, which should have been negligible in this section, was pushing against them with unexpected force. He signaled to Michael, who acknowledged the observation but indicated they should continue. The pothole room itself was a large chamber where several tunnel systems converged. Normally, it served as a natural resting point before divers continued deeper into the system. But today, the water was visibly clouded. Fine particles of silt hung suspended, reducing visibility from the expected 80 feet to barely 30. Michael made the hand signal for, "Is everyone okay?" Each diver responded with the okay sign, but Rebecca's response came with a noticeable hesitation. Her eyes, visible behind her mask, showed concern. Sarah swam to the guideline junction where they needed to make their turn toward the unexplored cathedral. She shined her light down the tunnel and then quickly signaled to the group. The passage ahead was significantly more silted than their maps had indicated. The heavy rains had clearly affected the system more than they had anticipated. Michael faced a decision: continue as planned into potentially hazardous conditions, or abort the mission and return to safety. Pride and ambition won out over caution. He signaled, "Proceed with care." The Northwest Passage narrowed considerably, forcing the divers to proceed in single file. Michael led, followed by Sarah, then Rebecca, with Jason taking the rear position. The silty conditions required perfect buoyancy control. Any errant fin kick could stir up clouds of sediment, further reducing visibility. They were approximately 900 feet from the entrance when disaster struck. Rebecca, struggling to manage both her diving equipment and the bulky camera, accidentally kicked too close to the ceiling. Her fins disturbed a layer of fine silt that had accumulated there, creating an instant silt out, a diver's nightmare where visibility drops to zero. "I couldn't see my hand in front of my face," she would later describe. "It was like being suddenly blinded." The proper procedure in such situations is to stop moving, hold the guideline, and wait for the silt to settle. But panic is the enemy of rational thought. Rebecca made the critical error of letting go of the line to reach for her camera, which was slipping from her grasp. In that moment of disconnection, she lost her orientation. When the silt temporarily cleared in patches, she realized with horror that she could no longer see the guideline or her teammates. She was adrift in the cave, separated from her lifeline. Jason, noticing his wife's absence, immediately signaled to the others. The team halted, their lights sweeping in arcs through the cloudy water. But Rebecca had drifted into a small side passage, a dead-end alcove not marked on their maps. "Rebecca!" Jason's voice was muffled by his regulator and the water, but the desperation was clear. Cave diving protocol strictly forbids removing the regulator to shout, but in his panic, he momentarily considered it. Michael quickly took control, signaling for Sarah to stay with the line, while he and Jason conducted a methodical search pattern. They would extend no more than 15 feet from the guideline, tethered to it and to each other by safety reels. Meanwhile, Rebecca was fighting her own battle against rising panic. Trained for such emergencies, she forced herself to stop, control her breathing, and think. She inflated her BCD slightly to rise toward the ceiling, hoping to find the main passage. Instead, her tanks clanked against solid rock. She was in a dead-end chamber, with no obvious exit. Her primary light swept across the confines of her stone prison, revealing no guideline, no exit, no teammates. Worse, the impact with the ceiling had dislodged more silt, further reducing visibility. Her breathing rate increased involuntarily, accelerating her air consumption. Back on the main line, the search for Rebecca was growing more frantic. Jason had deployed his safety reel to its full length, sweeping methodically through the murky water. Sarah maintained her position at their original stopping point, her light serving as a beacon. Michael checked his dive computer. They had been at depth for 45 minutes. Their planned bottom time was 60 minutes, allowing for a comfortable return with ample air reserves. That cushion was rapidly disappearing. We need to make some hard decisions, Michael thought as he signaled Jason to return to the line. The anguish in Jason's eyes was evident, but Michael's firm hand signals left no room for argument. They needed to regroup. Once back together, Michael outlined their options through hand signals. Continue searching for another 10 minutes, then begin retreat regardless of outcome. Jason shook his head vehemently, pointing to his air supply, indicating he would stay. Sarah's hand signals were clear. Splitting up would only compound the disaster. They needed to stay together, continue a structured search, and preserve enough air for everyone to exit safely. As they deliberated, Rebecca was making a discovery in her isolated chamber. Her light had caught a glimpse of something reflective, an old abandoned guideline partially buried in silt. It wasn't on their maps, likely placed by explorers years ago and forgotten. Following cave diving protocol, she deployed her safety reel, creating a connection between herself and this found line. With trembling hands, she began to follow this unknown path, hoping it would lead back to the main passage. Each kick was measured, each breath controlled despite her rising fear. The situation deteriorated further when Sarah noticed that the current in the main passage was strengthening, a possible sign that water levels at the surface were rising due to sudden rain. Their planned exit route might soon become more challenging. Michael signaled a final decision. 5 more minutes of searching, then retreat. Jason reluctantly agreed, his face a mask of conflicted emotions behind his diving gear. As they conducted their final search pattern, Rebecca was following the abandoned line through a narrow restriction. The passage was barely wide enough for her and her tanks, forcing her to wriggle through while maintaining her grip on both the line and her light. Then, a moment of hope. The passage widened, and her light caught the reflection of the main guideline. She had found her way back to the primary route, but was she ahead or behind her team? With no way to know, she made the decision to follow the line toward what she hoped was the exit. By cruel coincidence, she emerged onto the main line just minutes after her teammates had passed that junction, continuing their search in the opposite direction. 2 groups, separated by mere minutes and meters, each unaware of the other's position. As Michael's designated search time expired, he made the difficult signal to begin their exit. Jason's resistance was physical now. He shook his head and pointed back into the silty passage. Michael gripped his arm firmly, his eyes conveying what his voice could not. Staying would likely result in 2 deaths, not 1 rescue. The reluctant retreat began, each diver checking and rechecking their air supplies. Jason's consumption had increased dramatically due to his exertion and stress, leaving him with notably less reserve than the others. Unknown to them, Rebecca was now following the same guideline, but was approximately 200 feet behind them. Her isolation had forced a hyper-awareness of her situation. She had calculated her air supply meticulously, determining she had enough for a controlled exit if she maintained a steady pace and calm breathing pattern. The team's progress toward the exit was impeded by the strengthening current and deteriorating visibility. What should have been a 20-minute return journey was stretching into 30 minutes and beyond. Jason's air reserves dwindled dangerously. At approximately 500 feet from the exit, he signaled a critical air warning to Michael. Without hesitation, Michael offered his alternate air source, his octopus regulator, signaling that they would buddy breathe the remainder of the way out. Sarah, witnessing this exchange, checked her own supply. She had enough for herself, but little excess to share. The margin for error was gone. They were now in pure survival mode. As the team slowly progressed toward the exit, Rebecca maintained her steady pace behind them. The gap was closing, though neither party was aware of the other's presence due to the limited visibility. It was Sarah who first noticed the faint glow of a light behind them. Initially mistaking it for a reflection, she turned to find Rebecca emerging from the silty water like an apparition. The reunion, while silent due to their regulators, was emotionally charged. Jason's eyes widened in disbelief and relief. Quick hand signals communicated the situation. Jason and Michael were buddy breathing, air supplies were critical, and they needed to exit immediately. Rebecca, having conserved her air during her isolated journey, had a relatively better supply. She offered her alternate regulator to Jason, allowing Michael to reclaim his own air supply. This redistribution gave them a slightly better margin, but the exit was still far from guaranteed. The strengthening current continued to work against them, and Jason's earlier exertion had left him physically drained. The pothole room, normally a landmark of relief signaling the approach to the exit, today served as the site of another critical decision. Jason's borrowed air supply was depleting rapidly despite Rebecca's careful monitoring. They were still 300 feet from the exit, a distance that might as well have been miles given their circumstances. Michael made a bold decision. He signaled for Sarah, who had the most remaining air, to surge ahead to the exit and alert potential rescuers that divers with air emergencies were following. It was a calculated risk. Breaking the team again went against protocol, but waiting could prove fatal. Sarah hesitated only briefly before acknowledging the command. With a reassuring tap on Jason's shoulder, she streamlined her position and kicked powerfully toward the exit, fighting against the current. The remaining three continued at a pace dictated by Jason's condition. Rebecca and Michael positioned themselves on either side of him, partly to guide him and partly to assist if he began to struggle. The final 200 feet became an exercise in pure will. Jason's breathing grew labored as the borrowed tank approached emptiness. Michael signaled for even slower, shallower breaths, conservation techniques that might buy precious additional minutes. Light began to filter through the water. The exit was near, but Jason's borrowed regulator was delivering its final breaths of air. In a last desperate push, Michael and Rebecca virtually carried Jason between them, their own air supplies approaching critical levels. The team broke the surface of the spring basin, with less than 30 seconds of air remaining in Jason's borrowed tank. Sarah had indeed reached the surface minutes earlier, alerting a group of recreational divers who were preparing for their own dive. These divers had immediately positioned themselves at the water's edge, ready to assist. Masks were torn off, regulators spat out, and gasping breaths of sweet surface air filled burning lungs. Equipment was hastily discarded as the exhausted divers were helped to shore. "Rebecca," Jason managed between desperate breaths. I thought. "I know," she replied, clutching his hand with trembling fingers. "I know." The physical toll was immediately evident. All four divers showed signs of extreme exertion and stress. Jason required oxygen supplementation, which fortunately was available in the park's emergency kit. But they had emerged, all of them, beating odds that had tilted heavily against them. "We got complacent," Michael admitted during their informal debrief at the same cabin where they had planned the dive with such confidence. "We dismissed warnings, overestimated our capabilities, and underestimated the environment." Sarah nodded in agreement. The signs were there. The recent rains, the local warnings. We chose to see what we wanted to see. For Rebecca, the experience had been transformative. When I was alone in that side passage, I was certain I would die there. Every breath felt like it might be my last. She paused, gathering herself. But something happens in that moment, a clarity. You realize what matters and what doesn't. Jason had been the most deeply affected. His willingness to sacrifice himself in the search for Rebecca had nearly cost him his life. "I couldn't leave her," he said simply. "I couldn't." There have been other times cave divers have made bad decisions. Click on the video on screen to watch what happens when cave divers go missing, forever.